Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Mikkel Thorup, and this is the Expat Money Show. Today's guest is a returning guest. In episode 246, Ernie Baca came on to talk to us about his experiences of living in Mexico and beating cancer in Mexico. If you guys haven't heard that episode, I highly suggest you go back and listen to that one. It was unbelievable. I had shivers going down my arm. It was crazy. Today, what I want to do is invite Ernie back to the show, and we're going to be talking a little bit about his work in law enforcement, specifically in Latin America, and some of the safety concerns and tips and tricks and anything to do with safety and security in Latin America. So, Ernie, welcome back to the show. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Mikkel. It's an honor to be on your show, and thank you for having me back.
Pleasure is mine. Maybe you guys, maybe you can give the guys a quick background on your professional capacity and why you get to talk about these types of things.
Well, Mikkel, I started my actual career with the United States Marshal Service, and several of their duty, they have several duties, and one of their duties is the security of the courthouse, the federal court, the court system. And so basically I was given that duty. And then we also have the duty of fugitives. And then I was also on several task forces, violent crimes task forces, DEA task forces while I was with the U.S. Marshal Service. I spent 10 years with them. And as you said in my last intro, I provided security for high threat trials such as John Gotti, Timothy McVeigh, the World Trade Center bombers. Later on in my career, I went on to what used to be the United States Customs Service, Department of Treasury, and I became a special agent with them. And post 9/11, they created the Department of Homeland Security, and I was absorbed into what now is known as Homeland Security Investigations. During my time with the Marshal Service, I worked on the border, so I worked hand in hand with the Mexican government on fugitive issues. And later on in Homeland Security, with Homeland Security Investigations, while I was in DC, I worked extensively I was in the National Security Division, and then I went to the Financial Investigations Divisions, and we had several programs within Latin America where we assisted the countries of Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay. And it was a symbiotic relationship between these countries and us. We exchanged information. I worked on several of those projects. I've also worked in the Middle East. I put together a international task force in the Middle East. And so I have a wide array of background in Latin America and also overseas. Not to mention, I also spent 3 years as a country attaché. So basically, I was the representative for Homeland Security in Brazil for 3 years.
Well, I think it's really interesting because pretty much all of the countries that you just mentioned are super popular places with expats and places that I have very strong ties in, that I have lived in a lot of those countries and have residencies in a lot of those countries that you've mentioned. So it's very interesting to have someone with your experience onto the program to talk about the security in these countries. And as I said in our last episode, you were hunting bad guys, like legit bad guys, not traffic fines, not like real bad guys. So I mean, I'm happy to kind of take the conversation in whichever direction you would like. Maybe we can start with, Mexico and move on to a little bit in Brazil or some of your experiences in Colombia. I mean, those are really popular places these days for expats.
Well, Mikkel, security. Let me first start off with something that, I always like to talk about security. And actually, I kind of stole this from George Carlin. George Carlin, in one of his bits, it's an old bit that he does, and he says, and excuse the comments, it's actually George Carlin that I'm quoting here, but he said, security is an illusion. Security is an illusion to make white people feel safe. And it's a joke that he makes, and he talks about airport security and how, all of these, you go through this airport security, but it's not really secure and that type of thing. But I always use that as an example because I always say the same thing. Security is an illusion. And what I mean by an illusion is that we tend to think of security of, okay, I'm in Mexico, I'm safe. I'm in Colombia, I'm safe. Or we compare, like, for example, I live in Mexico right now. The cartels are very famous here. They've made national news. There's several congressmen in the United States that want to send the military in to fight the cartels. So what ends up happening in these cases is that you start with this misconception that Mexico is this place where they're shooting back and forth every day, and no matter where you go, it's dangerous because there's a cartel and they're going to send in the military. And that's not necessarily true. And when I say it's an illusion, though, at the same time, you have a lot of expats that live here, and one of the obstacles that I have to overcome when I explain security to these people in Mexico is that, normally what happens is, well, there's mass shootings in the United States. I feel safer here in Mexico because it's safer here in Mexico. And it's not necessarily safer in the sense, the way I see security, and I've spent 30 years in that field, is that security is something that this illusion that we create, and we start creating this illusion to feel safe. And the minute we start feeling safe that's when it becomes dangerous. And what I mean by feeling safe is, for example, here in Mexico, they usually, a lot of people say, well, I do a lot of security alerts. Like, for example, when there's a lot of activity on the border, because there's a lot of expats that travel to the United States or to Canada through the United States. And I say, don't travel through this area right now. It's not very good because there's a lot of violence going on, and I always get the, well, I went through there 2 days ago and nothing happened. I went through there, and everybody starts creating this false sense that it's okay. And I said, you might have gone through there 2 days ago and it was fine, or you weren't there when all the violence was going on, but it's a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so you just need to be aware. And it's not about, I feel safe here in Mexico. I haven't had any issues. I travel up and down the roads, but there's certain things that I do that I ensure my security, no matter where I go. And one of the arguments is, I tell people when they say, I went through this road 2 days ago, which I tell people not to go through at that time. And I say, well, I was in Chicago working undercover in some of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago. Nothing ever happened to me. Does that mean that neighborhood is safe? And it's a matter of understanding what's going on. For example, when I travel to the border, I check the news. Tomorrow, I have a trip to the border. I'm going through an area that's very, very hot right now. But I'm going through an area that I know, that I grew up around. Not only am I going through that area, but before we leave, we're going to check the news. I only go at certain hours. So what the whole thing of security is mitigating risk. That's what I always tell people. It's mitigating risk. And these countries can be dangerous. We talk about Colombia. Colombia was gained fame for Pablo Escobar and drug trafficking and everything else. But you go to Bogota, you don't run into drug traffickers. You come here to Mexico, you don't run into drug unless you're in the business. Sure. And I had the privilege of seeing intelligence reports. I saw on a daily basis what was going on in Mexico, what was going on in Colombia. And if I took that and I told the public, they would freak out. But it's not because it's a really bad place. It's just because I gained one side, or I would receive one side of information that other people didn't have access to. And sometimes what happens is you can take that information, misconstrue it, and all of a sudden Mexico's dangerous. Or all of a sudden, Colombia is dangerous. I mean, I can even tell you from my coworkers, when I tell people I live in Mexico, they think I'm crazy. And those coworkers are coworkers that we worked different investigations on the cartels and all of that stuff. So we saw the same reports, and they're like, "How could you dare go down there?" And it's like, yes, but I'm not going to where the reports are. I don't live in those areas. I don't hanging out in those areas. And I think security is something that if you take some simple steps, that's all it takes is some simple steps, you'll be safe. There's no such thing as 100% safe, no matter where you go in the world. If you go to the United States, I could go to the safest city in the United States and somebody, for some reason, goes crazy and does a mass shooting. It could happen. Things happen. And, I always equivocated to also getting drunk and driving. What happens when you get behind the wheel? 90% of the time, nothing happens. You don't get into a car accident. It's that one time that you do get in the car accident that it's fatal. So what's the best remedy? Don't get behind the wheel drunk. And it's the same thing with security. What's the best remedy? Don't do certain things and you'll be fine. And you reduce that risk.
Yeah, I think that these are very important points because situational awareness is unbelievably important when not just in traveling or being an expat, but anywhere in life. I've been traveling now for 23 years straight, and I've been to 110 countries. I've never been mugged. I've never been robbed. I've never been kidnapped. I've never been attacked. I've never had any of these types of things that have ever happened to me. And I was in El Salvador 20 years ago. I've drove across Africa and South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Kenya, Uruguay, Uganda, excuse me. I've been to Iran and North Korea and all these countries, and I've never had any problem. But it's not necessarily that I'm saying every single one of these countries in every area is safe. It's that I took certain measures to make sure that I was safe. I wasn't out drinking at 2:00 in the morning or going into areas that I know I shouldn't be in. I wasn't flashing expensive jewelry. I wasn't being lippy to other people or putting myself in situations that were going to be, get me in a situation that I didn't want. Like I live in Panama City right now, downtown Panama City. I live in the best area that is here, and I'm not walking around here at 2:00 in the morning by myself or anything like that. And I own a firearm and I have a concealed carry license and stuff like that. I'm still not going out at 2:00 in the morning doing silly things, right? I want to make sure that, I'm going out at normal times. I'll take an Uber Black to the restaurant that I'm going to. Then we have one pick us up at the restaurant or at the hotel, drive us home. 4 years here in Panama, not one problem. I've not had one of my clients who have had a problem here, but is the situational awareness and just making good decisions throughout your day.
Exactly, Mikkel. And it's very important that you have that situational awareness. And just like you said, you take certain precautions. I'll use Mexico, for example, and then I'll go on to Brazil. But Mexico, for example, when you're traveling, there's really simple things that you can do. Don't travel at night. Like you said, don't go at 2:00 in the morning in downtown Panama, but don't travel at night. Stay with traffic. Don't get isolated. Just because there's military around, don't think of it that they're safe, that they're protecting you. Maybe there's military around because there's a lot of activity going on. Be a little bit more alert. Stop at gas stations that are large gas stations where everybody's stopping at. Don't stop at remote gas stations. Send your live location in WhatsApp to your loved ones and your family members. Actually, I have an app that I use called 360. I'm not associated with them, but I have the Find My iPhone, and I have an app, a GPS tracking app, and my wife and I know where each other is at all the time. And it's for security reasons. We know that if something happens, we know the last location. Even if they tell you to turn off the phone, we know the last location. We know that if, for example, my wife has the U.S. Embassy's phone number on speed dial, so do I. If anything happens and she doesn't show up or I don't show up, we contact the embassy right away. Those are things that you can do to mitigate this risk. And like you said, take an Uber Black, because Uber, they keep track of who the drivers are. They know which driver was the last one to pick you up. So if something happens to you, you're prepared. And having situational awareness, for example, my wife and I, we've even been here in Mexico at the bus station. Someone tried to get our attention in a van. They opened up the door to the van, and right away, we walked straight into the bus station because we knew Not that they were targeting us. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they were. But we knew right away that, you know what, if we pay attention to them, they may pull us into that van. And it's not that they may have even been looking at somebody else or trying to get someone else's attention. But we had that awareness that, you know what, run into the bus station right away because we don't want any problems. And those are the types of things that you can do to mitigate these types of risks. Like you said, also, don't take flashy, don't be wearing a Rolex watch. Also, the other thing too is if you're a tourist, I'll use a perfect example in Brazil. We had a undercover unit from FBI come in to Brazil that they do undercover operations in different countries. And we were hosting them because they wanted to do an evaluation of Brazil. And we went to Rio de Janeiro and we were staying on the Copacabana beach. And one of the things that you want to do when you get to the hotel is talk to the bellhop, talk to the people talk to the desk attendant, ask exactly how, what can I do? Where can I go? Because if you go on the Copacabana beach, you can go at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. If you walk on the boardwalk, you can walk on the boardwalk at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and no one's going to bother you. There's plenty of police security. But I'll tell you what, if you go a block away from the beach, you're in the middle of the hood. And if you go onto the beach, because it's a very common practice where people will say, hey, let's go for a walk on the beach. And there's somebody on the beach in the dark that comes up to you and robs you. Mm-hmm. So what will the bellhop tell you? Don't go onto the beach after dark. Don't go behind the hotel after dark. Well, this FBI agent, him and his wife, actually was a pair that actually worked together. And we told him, look, if you're going to go for a walk, don't go for a walk on the beach at night and don't go a block south of the hotel. Just stay on the boardwalk. Whatever you do, stay. And this guy got an attitude with us and told us, you know what? I've been in the worst neighborhoods in all of them. I've been in Thailand. I've been in the worst neighborhood. One of the things that he forgot is that he had a whole team covering him. He had a whole team taking care of him in those neighborhoods. Well, needless to say, we woke up the next morning and the agent got robbed because they decided they were going to go for a walk on the beach, which we told them not to do. And this is an FBI agent. This is not anybody normal, but this is an FBI agent that didn't listen to us. And we were, I worked there. I knew how it worked. And we told him, do not go on the beach. And he did, because him and his wife wanted to go for a romantic walk on the beach at night. And of course, thinking I'm an FBI agent and nothing's ever happened to me, that's not the attitude to take. And this is kind of I'm not trying to put down FBI or anything else, but this is a perfect example of the attitude people take that, oh, I'm fine. I'm safe. I'm in a safe area. I'm in the best area. For example, you said in Panama, you live in the nicest neighborhood. Just taking that for granted that I live in the nicest neighborhood, that nothing's going to happen. That's the illusion I talk about. Talk about airport security. I'll give you a perfect example of airport security. In the United States, after 9/11, TSA, we used to call them TSA 1,000 standing around because they basically hired a bunch of people. Now they have body scanners. You go through scanning devices for metal. And I've even been through where they've even searched me because the metal detector went off and, I had a little coin in my pocket or something that made it go off. And we build that sense of security, but if someone really wants to hijack a plane, they're going to hijack a plane, no matter what. And I can tell you right now, the Inspector General, they do Department of Homeland Security or the Inspector General for TSA, they basically do annual evaluations. They actually send people through security, hiding weapons, hiding things that shouldn't be hidden. And let's see how much stuff we can get across. And to be honest with you, if you read some of those reports, some of the stuff that gets through security, even with all of that stuff, but see what what people don't understand is like what George Carlin was saying. It's an illusion to make you feel safe. And so those are the things that you need to take into consideration. Having a false sense of security or saying that I'm safe, I'm fine, that's the illusion you're building in your head. You're convincing yourself you're safe. And I'm not trying, a lot of people say, well, you're trying to scare everybody. No, I'm not trying to scare everybody. Like I said, if you take certain precautions, you're going to mitigate the risk. Okay. You take Secret Service, they protect the president of the United States. When they do their work, they are already aware that something could happen. So what do? They take every single scenario that can happen and let's mitigate it. If we know that there's an entrance that's not covered, or there's an entrance or an exit or whatever, they go and they do a survey and they say, okay, this is what we're going to do to mitigate this risk, because someone can come in through here or someone can come in through there. And what happens? The president shows up, nothing happens, nobody gets hurt, and they move on. But they have prepared for every single different scenario. Now, they can't prepare for 100% of the scenarios, and they know that, but they can prepare for 90%, 95%. And so they have their methods of preparing for those 95% of those scenarios. So that's what we need to keep in mind when we talk about security.
No, those are all very important points. And then to circle back just on the Uber Black, what I've done, and this is just a quick tip for people, is you can actually set a family plan. So my mother, my wife, and me are all on a family plan. And then I've set it up so that we get an email automatically when one of the cars picks someone up, and I've built a folder on my email. And so every single time, every single trip, I have it logged. So we know who the driver was, the license plate, where it was picked up, and where it was dropped off. And then it shares. So I get a notification from my wife when she goes to the supermarket and comes back. And when I go out for a business lunch, she gets a notification on her phone, and same with my mother. So that way we kind of always are looking out for one another, and we know what would happen, if someone doesn't show up or is supposed to be somewhere and they're not there. It's like, well, where was the last place? With the taxis and you're paying cash, although I do love cash and I think cash is a great thing, I think that it's a lot more difficult to track these types of things and to protect yourself in some random car that you've just, because it's yellow, you've jumped inside it and you think that is trustworthy. So obviously everything is going to have give and take, and we have privacy concerns and security concerns, and we have to balance these types of things, what someone feels comfortable with. But it's also important to try to stack these things in your life. My example before, and thank you for calling me on it, is that I live in a very safe neighborhood, but I don't live in a very safe neighborhood and then I'm like, that's it, and then be arrogant about it and not do anything else. You have to do everything in a row. You want to try to stack one thing on top of the next thing, on top of the next thing, on top of the next thing. I have great situational awareness. When I get out of a car, I'm walking around. Before I pull out my keys and things like that, I will have a look around. Before I get out of an Uber Black at night, I have my keys in my hand, ready to go. And the security is right there. And I give him a wave and everything like that. And so when we're even going from the car into the building, the security, I've made eye contact with him. He knows we're coming in, everything like that. And I'm not a paranoid person. This doesn't negatively affect my life or make me feel like I'm unsafe. Actually, I think that this is just falls in the category of personal responsibility. I think that you have to look after yourself, whether you're in Panama, where I am today, and I would generally consider Panama to be quite a safe place, certainly compared to some other countries in Latin America. I feel safe here. But if you're in Mexico, and we've lived in Brazil, and we've lived in many of these types of countries, I would do things like this when I lived in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, which is probably regarded as the most safe country in the world. I'd still have situational awareness about it. And I can tell you, there are many places back home in Canada, many places in the United States that are a whole heck of a lot less safe than some of the countries that I've lived in around the world.
Exactly. And you know what, Mikkel, you bring up a good point. When you talk about the processes that you use. You always check out the security. You always see, you make eye contact, or when you're getting out, when you're getting into the car, you look around. But actually, those are habits that you build. Maybe without even realizing it, you do these things. I don't think you probably think about it. I mean, you're thinking about it now because we're talking about
I'm
it.
definitely running through things at the moment as we're talking, but I can tell you there's no way that I'm like, I know that I physically do them and I have these mental checklists in my head, but I'm not like, okay, stop. Now I need to do this. Same type of thing. I'll give you another example and then I'll let you continue. Say I go to a brand new city and I walk out of the hotel. It's middle of the day. I'm going for a walk, and I'm walking down the block. Every 100 meters, couple 100 meters, I turn around, I take a look behind me, and I try to make a mental map in my head of how I got there. Because when you turn around to go back to the hotel, it's all now in reverse, right? Because you've turned right out of the hotel and gone down the street. Well, when you're coming back, it's now left for you. So you actually have to build this mental model in your head of your situational awareness, where you are in relation to everything else, because you want to make sure that you can find your way home. You know where you're going. You're not ending up in a bad area or an area you're not supposed to be in, or, so you have to be, you have to think these things through, and it does become a habit. Absolutely.
And the more you do it, it becomes a habit. And I always tell people that if you build these habits, you don't even think about it. Like, for example, I spent 30 years in law enforcement, and, a lot of times you end up kind of, there's a lot of habits that I still have when I go into a restaurant. I'll always go to the back of the restaurant. I'll always sit in the corner. I'm always facing the door. And a lot of times I have perceptions, those people at that table over there, there's something wrong. I can probably go into a restaurant here in Monterrey and tell you who's cartel, who's not. Not necessarily that they're there to, but I'm aware that they are, or they possibly are. So I'm going to stay far away, because normally if someone's going to come in and hit a cartel member, they're going to go straight to that person. They're going to go do their stuff and they're going to get out. Not that this is going to happen. These are things that go through my mind, but it's a habit. It's a habit that I built over time. And those are the things that I tell people is, if you build these habits, for example, you won't have to even think about it. You'll just do it. And that's what's very important. And it's being able to see around you and being able to evaluate the situation. The other thing I say about human nature, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, when you get a bad feeling about something, humans are very intuitive. We're very intuitive people. And they talk about this in entrepreneurship. If you have a bad feeling, don't go with it. Go with what you feel is going to work. And the reason why is they say, trust your gut or trust your intuition. And, many times that I've been in situations where things are going to go south, I felt bad. There's something wrong with the situation. Even when I was doing undercover work, when you do undercover work and you don't feel good in a meeting, or you don't feel good meeting with the person, you either say, you know what, not today, or you might tell your cover team, you know what, take this down because it's not right. And many times that you get that gut feeling, or I got that gut feeling, and I said, no more. Or maybe, I had that gut feeling that, okay, this guy looks dangerous, or he pulled out a gun on me, but I think I'm good because he doesn't look like. You use that intuition. And it's the same thing when you're out, and I'm talking from a law enforcement perspective and working undercover, but you can utilize those same things in that you're walking down the street, and I've seen the same person like 5 times. Every time I'm looking behind me, usually when someone's following you, we used to, in surveillance school, we used to say, you always look for the same person or same thing in succession, in close succession. So for example, if you see a person, let's say you see this person, and 5 minutes later you see that same person in another place, then there's more than likely that they're following you. And those are the types of things and trust your gut. I'm going to go down the street and it just doesn't look right. You trust your gut. And that, I'll tell you what, trusting your intuition and even if there is nothing wrong, I've never been 100% right with my gut. We've even, had to stop things when I didn't feel right. And it kind of messed the whole investigation up because nothing was really wrong there. But, we always used to say safety is first, and that's what we always, the safety of the agents are first. And if I felt that the agents around me weren't going to be safe, I mean, even if I felt safe, I called it and I would say, nope, we're out. And even when I was a supervisor, we're out. We're not doing this. I don't care how good the case is. We're not doing this. And maybe 9 times out of 10, I was right. One time I was wrong, but you put up with the times that you're wrong so that you can be right. That's basically how it works.
For sure, for sure. My wife always laughs at me because every time we go into a restaurant, I'll rearrange all of the seating for everybody, and I have no qualms about it because I have to sit with my back against the wall. I can't have a meeting or enjoy a dinner or relax with clients or something like that if people are walking behind me, or if I can see them out of my peripheral view or anything like that. I need to have my back against a wall. I need to be able to have the full view of everything. And once again, it just kind of goes back to those habits that, I have built into myself and my personal responsibility as a husband, as a father, as a son, as a business owner, as people that I care for. All of these things for me to feel good about situation. There's certain things that have to happen. So sometimes we'll get there and there'll be like 7 people and I'll make people move. Like, I don't care. I'm like, no, let's do this. Let's change this. And you sit over here. I always sit with my back against a solid wall and viewing the room, as you had said.
And like I said, it's just building little habits and building habits that you feel that are going to make you feel that you can, for example, even the other thing that I do is when I go into a restaurant, it's where's the exits? Because you're not necessarily always going to be able to go out the front door if something happens. But these are little things that I'm telling you from a law enforcement perspective, but you can utilize them in your daily life. Even when I used to go to Rio, I'll give an example. When I used to travel to Rio, because I was not when I was in Brazil, I was based in Brasilia, which is the capital, and we used to go and do our operations in different places with the federal police there. And we did a lot of traveling to Rio, Sao Paulo. And Rio is kind of a different animal. Sao Paulo is also dangerous in the sense of a big city. It's kind of like New York, walking through, you just don't want to go through certain places. But I use Rio as an example because we used to go out a lot. And also on a diplomatic end, we used to have a lot of assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries of Homeland Security, also even hosting deputy secretaries of different departments that were in our purview of helping out with, for example, Department of Justice. People would come down and we'd introduce them to our federal police contacts. And when we would go to Rio, I would take one credit card or one debit card that I knew didn't have a lot of money on it or whatever. And I would put it in a different, I had a separate wallet that would take with me. So I would have a certain amount of cash that I would always have. So if I had to give my wallet, okay, I'm losing my debit card and I can call the bank. I didn't have my full wallet with every single credit card that I had, my ID. And actually I would take an ID. I would take my diplomatic ID that I knew actually I wouldn't even take my local IDs or driver's licenses or anything else. I had a diplomatic, they issued me a little diplomatic ID that I would carry with me. And that way, even if somebody robbed me and saw, oh, shoot, this guy's a diplomat, those are things that I used to do. And I used to say, okay, well, if I lose $100, it's not a big deal. Even now in Mexico, you're supposed to carry your resident card with you everywhere. And a lot of people say, no, I don't want to lose it because it's a pain. I carry it. I have a small wallet. I put it in a pocket that's very hard to pickpocket. If they try to pull it out of my pocket, it's very hard. I have an air tag on the wallet. So at least I'm probably more than likely they're going to take my credit cards and they're going to throw the wallet somewhere. So hopefully I can locate the wallet with my residency card in it. And I can call the bank and cancel all my credit cards. And So those are things that you can do that, you know, and I always say 99% of the time, nothing's going to happen. I survived a 30-year law enforcement career. Like I said in the last episode, I had some close calls, but nothing serious to the point. But if you look at even in my agency, the percentage of agents that do get injured or seriously hurt or killed, it's a very small percentage compared to the amount of agents that we have in the agency. But it's because we take precautions. It's because we do certain things. When we do certain operations, we always had the control of the situation. And you can take control of your own situation no matter where you're at in the world. And I even tell people, these are things that you need to do even when you're back home in the United States, where if you say it's safer or you feel it's safer. I mean, in the United States, you can go to middle of Ohio and think you're safe, and maybe you're not, because you're not a local person there. And the local person there, or the local drug addicts there, need to rob somebody to get money for drugs. And even though that place is considered the safest city in the world, or in the United States, it may not be safe for you if you're not taking those precautions. I think safety has to do with, like you said, a personal responsibility that the person takes, and it's your actions that actually dictate security. It's not the amount of police that are on the street. It's not the checkpoints. It's not the magnetometers. It's the things that you do to mitigate. Here's the thing in security, and I'll tell you what, even private security, bodyguard services, everybody does this. You do a risk assessment. When you're protecting somebody, when we were protecting a judge or you protecting an executive, you do a risk assessment. When the executive or the judge or the president or whoever's going to go, what's the risk of the place that he's going to go to? For example, an executive might be going to a rival company, and believe it or not, this could be actually dangerous for those executive, because you're talking about a rival company. We're going to be on somebody else's turf, per se, security wise and everything else. And you look at all the different risks. You do an assessment. Which buildings are we going to go into? Who are we going to see? Why aren't they going to let us in with my bodyguards in? Why are my bodyguards have to stay outside? How come they can't come in with me? All of those things. Now, you're still going to have to put up with those restrictions. Your bodyguards can't come in with you in the building. But you know what? How are we going to mitigate that? What are we going to do to mitigate that risk? Now, we can't make it 100% safe. We can't mitigate it 100%, but I don't know. Maybe we can put a bodyguard in the back and a bodyguard in the front. And if we have to run in, we know it, the door that's closest proximity to where they're going to be having the meeting. Those are the things that you do and you plan. And 99% of the time, you plan for things that aren't going to happen. Believe it or not, that's the way it works in the security industry. And that's the way it should work for personal security. 99% of the time, you plan for something that 99% probably won't happen. And guess what? You've mitigated your risk.
Well, it's interesting. I have very dear friends of mine who own a precious metals vault, and they've told me on multiple occasions, for the first 30 to 45 minutes of every single day, the group of guys, they sit down, they look at all of the risks surrounding their geographic location, not just in that area or neighborhood, but in the whole province, of the whole country and the whole region. So what's happening in neighboring countries, what's happening with different cartels and governments and socialism and all of these types of things, what's happening in the stability in the area. They're looking at every type of things. It's like, well, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong? This is how I try to plan out a lot of my work with my private clients, is I never make assumptions when we go through a plan that we're 100% right. I always want to think, okay, well, what is the downside risk here? What's going to happen if we've made a mistake or our assumptions are wrong on these things? We want to make sure that we have these redundancies in place over and over and over again. And yeah, same type of thing. Like I deal more in financial markets and things like this with risk mitigation, but it's the same type of concept, is that 99% of the things that we prepare for, they never happen. But that's okay. You still need to be prepared for them. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and it's a matter of having I call it an escape plan. It's a matter of having that escape plan. And you're totally right, Mikkel. Even in financial markets, especially when something's very volatile, you need to prepare for that, right? And so what do? I'm just going to make a hypothetical situation because I'm not very into the stock market or whatever. But let's say the stock market is volatile right now, but I got a good opportunity to make some money. You're going to put those, buys and sells in at a certain point, and then you're going to pull out at a certain point to stay secure because you don't know if it's going to keep going down. And those are the things that you do so that, okay, if all goes great, I'm going to make a lot of money. If all goes bad, I lost a certain amount of money, but I didn't lose my shirt. Mm-hmm. And that's what you basically have to do when it comes to security. And it's a matter of sitting down and planning. And like, for example, tomorrow, if you were contracted me to be your bodyguard tomorrow, every morning, Mikkel, we would sit down and say, let me see your schedule. What are you going to do today? And I'd have a whole team. If you said, well, I'm going to go to breakfast at this place, we're going to go here, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I'd have a whole team saying, okay, well, what time does this place open? Where is it located? What neighborhood is it located in? Those are all types of, a lot of people, when you see bodyguards walking around with a celebrity or anybody else, you think, oh, it's just a big guy that's hanging out with the celebrity. What you don't understand is there's a whole team behind those guys that's visiting the restaurants they're going to go to, visiting these places where they're going to be. And you know what? Not all the time does it happen. For example, I've been in the protection industry, not in the industry, but in when we were protecting a protectee. And what's your plans for today? Oh, we're going to go to breakfast at this restaurant. And you're in the car, you're driving the guy to the restaurant. He says, you know what? I don't feel like going to that restaurant. I feel like going to another one. And you have to react and say, oh, shoot, we're going to another restaurant. You can't tell the protectee, no, we can only go to this restaurant. No, you have to adjust. You have to react. And, we have a whole team that's ready to react for any kind of change that the protectee needs to have done. And I'm not going into the trade secrets of how we do it, but, it's a matter of preparation. There's a lot there's a lot more to it than what I'm simplifying it a lot.
Of course.
But, I'm oversimplifying it in some senses, but, that's a complex situation. You have a very important person, a federal judge, a Supreme Court justice, high threat trials such as John Gotti. You're looking at a mobster that you got on trial. Those types of things you need to plan for, totally different than your own personal security. But the point I'm trying to make is you can take those simple things, because they're simple concepts, and you can apply that to your everyday life. And if you apply that to your everyday life and you make it a habit, when people ask me, is Mexico safe? And the first thing I say is, it depends. I always answer it with, it depends. And everybody says, well, what do you mean it depends? I said, it depends how you act. It depends what you do. That's what makes you safe here in Mexico. It has nothing to do with the cartels. It has nothing to do. It has everything to do with your actions while you're here. That's what it has to do with. Even when I read news reports of Americans, there's been a couple of news reports. There was one in Matamoros not too long ago. 3 Americans went into the border town of Matamoros, and they ended up at a cartel checkpoint. They ended up getting kidnapped. 2 of them got killed, and everybody went crazy. And first of all, they were there supposedly for plastic surgery. And I'm sitting there looking at these news reports. And first of all, you don't go to Matamoros for plastic surgery. That's the last place in Mexico you want to go for plastic surgery. Second of all, and then some people say, oh, well, they had criminal histories. They might have been down there. It doesn't matter. It's the actions that these people took that got them to that point. They should have never crossed the border to begin with in that area. that area is very dangerous, plastic surgery or no plastic surgery. And whether there was a case of mistaken identity or it was a case that they were there to do business, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't be there to begin with. And it was their actions. And I'm not trying to, don't get me wrong. This is a tragic situation. And, and it does sound bad that I'm saying, well, it was their action, it was their fault. And unfortunately, that's the reality. And when you get robbed, yes, it could be random. What happened to these people were random. They got stopped at a random checkpoint, but they didn't do the things to mitigate that risk to begin with. That's the thing that really gets me is, you know what? You can travel down the most dangerous highway here in Mexico and be completely safe. But it's because of your actions that make you safe. It's not because the highway's got more security. It's not because the highway has more police. It's not because, or it might be that you just don't travel down a certain highway. You're going to take a different route because that route right now is not, or you don't go through certain states here in Mexico that are very cartel controlled. You don't go through certain cities. And even when I go to the border, I take a certain route that I know that the cartel doesn't really, they're more to the east. They have a lot more activity to the east instead of to the west because this kind of the outskirts of town and where all the plants are. So I do all of those things. Now, does that mean that I'm not going to get stopped or there's not going to be a cartel checkpoint when I get there? No, that doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is that I've already mitigated those risks. I've already made those plans in case something happens. Not only that, I drive a Jeep Cherokee with a 5.7 Hemi engine in it. It guzzles gas. But I'll tell you what, if I need to get out of there, I can get out of there very quickly. And those are the things that I do. I could own a little Audi with a 4-cylinder engine, but I don't. And the reason why I don't is because, number one, I'm in a big truck if I have to hit something to get out of there. And number two, if I have to go at 100 miles an hour, I can. So those are the things, I'm not telling everybody to go buy a Grand Cherokee, but the reason why I do it is because I have to travel through those areas to get to McAllen, Texas. Mm-hmm. But, it's not a matter, it's a matter of what you do to mitigate everything. It's your own actions that's going to make you safe or going to make you, but the minute you start thinking, oh, it's safe, there's a bunch of police on the road, that's when you're going to get complacent. That's when you're not going to be looking around. That's when there's a car behind you and you haven't been noticing that it's been following you without plates for the last 3 miles, 4 miles. I've had cars follow me without plates. And what do my wife and I do? I take off at 100 miles an hour, knowing that the car can't keep up with me. I'll stop at a gas station or I'll stop at on the toll roads, at the toll booth, at the restroom, at the rest area to see if they keep going or see if they pull in with me. But I'm in a public place where they can't do anything. And a lot of times they keep going straight. And I stay at the rep stop until, and were they following me? I don't know. But I mitigated those risks and we were always alert. We're always looking for those things. And those are simple things that you can do to mitigate the risk. The problem that you have is assuming, there's a big saying, never assume anything, because if you take the word assume, you make an ass out of you and me. That is a very true statement. It's about never assume that you're safe. Never assume, oh, well, I'm in a good part of Mexico, or I'm a good part of Colombia, or I'm in the middle of Bogota. Nothing's going to happen to me. I can tell you what happened in Bogota to one of our agents. He got in a taxi, and that taxi's for the good part. If you go into Bogota and you take an official taxi, you're okay. But it was raining, and the guy knocked on the door, knocked on the window, like, "Hey, I'm getting wet. Please, 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 let's hire a taxi, please, please." And the agent said, "Okay." Opened the door. Guy got in, pulled a gun on him, and robbed him. And this is a seasoned Homeland Security agent that was there, and making the simple mistake of letting a guy, because he felt sorry for the guy because he's getting wet outside, and probably even the taxi driver was in on it, because he was stationary. Instead of him telling, get out of here to the taxi driver, he went and opened the door. These are things that you don't want to do when you're in a foreign country, no matter where you go. Even if you go to Europe and you might be in France or Rome or whatever, and you might feel safe because these places, many things don't happen. Well, things happen. It doesn't matter where you go. Things happen. But as long as you do your due diligence, you should be fine.
Well, quick story from my side, and you mentioned France, which is kind of ironic. Probably 18, 20 years ago, I was in the south of France, absolutely gorgeous part of the country, beautiful day. And I noticed this group of French punks following me behind with their dogs. And it went like 1 block, 2 block, and I knew something wasn't right. So I went into a McDonald's and I sat there at a McDonald's for an hour, 2 hours, something like that. And they got bored and kept going. I'm sure that they were following me, but I never shared a word with them. I never said anything. They didn't say anything to me, but it just didn't feel right. It was that gut feeling that you said before. And I just went into a McDonald's and sat down and just waited basically. And then, I don't know how long they were there. I was there for a couple of hours until I felt like it was fully safe before coming out again. But yeah, in so many years, just having being aware of all of these types of things, that's like the worst that's ever happened to me. But really, when you're describing a lot of these things, the word that comes to mind for me is mental models. So I have mental models for everything that I do in my life. It helps me in my decision-making process. I have certain screens or ideas that I like to run projects and investments and situations and people that I work through. I have these mental models of how things should work. And I have little checklists for everything that I do to help me in my decision-making process. And really, when you're describing a lot of these things, it sounds very similar to me in a physical sense of going through these types of things.
No, and it's just, I'll tell you what, Mikkel, it's part of life. I mean, you know what? If you build these habits of security, it can also help you in other parts of life. And, excuse me, being, for example, an entrepreneur, like you said, you have these certain processes that you're going to go through, and you have to have that discipline. If you don't have that discipline and you don't build those habits, then you're not going to get anywhere. And you can apply these to life also. I mean, it has nothing to do with security. It has to do with life. If you, for example, I'll give, and I might be getting off the topic of security, but this goes into the security when I talk about building habits. There's people have routines. Wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. From 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, I'm going to read my emails. From 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, I'll have my coffee and I'll have my breakfast. At 8 o'clock, I'm ready to work on this or work on that. And you have your routines. And even me as a retiree, I don't have a business that I'm running. I'm running a YouTube channel, but my wife and I have a routine. By 6:30 in the morning, we're already up. We're going for a walk. We're feeding our little ones. We have 2 little mini huskies. And then we have, okay, what are we going to do for today? And we make out a list the day before and we keep active. And even being a retiree or an expat overseas, a lot of times you got to build these habits so that you don't get bored or you don't get into a rut of just,
complacency.
What are we going to do today?
Complacency is the enemy. Exactly.
No, and you're completely right. And you become complacent. Complacency runs to procrastination, and in business, procrastination can mean, a loss of revenue, and procrastination can also mean, and when you talk about security and complacency, can mean that you didn't do something because you didn't feel like it, and it got you in trouble later on. And you can apply this to your whole life. I mean, this is something that I think if you make these habits and, different types of habits, your habits for work or your habits for your retired life or your habits for your security, like I said, they become habits. You don't think about them. I'm almost sure, Mikkel, you've got all these scenarios in your head. And right now you're telling me about this. but I'm almost sure that you do it without even thinking about it. I mean, you know what you got to do, and you're thinking about it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it goes through your head, but it's such a habit that it's automatic. And
there's a lot of habits in my life that are automatic, and I do habit stacking. So when I do one thing, then I do the next thing, then I do the next thing. So things go in progression. But at the same time, I think that it's really important to kind of look at certain aspects in your life exactly like an airline captain would. I know I have lots of clients who are captains who did very well for themselves, and I work with them. And I've been told and seen that they use checklists for everything. Even you've been a pilot for 20 years, 30 years, you've done this every single day. They still go through a checklist every single day. You know, every takeoff, every landing, they have a checklist on these things. So there's habits that I have built in, but I still go back to the having everything written out and worked out and make sure that I double check my own thing. And actually, I find it very relaxing. I had a conversation with my COO the other day, and we both love working from lists, because if I feel like I've missed something or I've forgotten something, then actually I find that stressful. When I have a big to-do list, when I've got a big list of all of these things, like today, as we're recording this, it's a Friday. I have my Friday wrap-up checklist, okay? It's got 15 things on it that I need to do before we hit the weekend. I have certain payroll things. I've got accounting things. I've got this. I got all of these types of things that need to be done. And then I'm able to relax. Well, a lot of these types of mental models and habits that you can build certainly apply to security. So when you're looking at this, you know, it's like, okay, first I'm going to do this, second I'm going to do this, third I'm going to do this. And then when you run through it, are you 100% safe? No, not 100%, but you're probably a lot more safe after going through it than if you went through nothing and you had no mental models of how this is going to work. Then everything would be a surprise to you.
No, and I'll give you a perfect example, Mikkel, and this is a story. It's an actual personal story of mine. In law enforcement, we train. If you go to any law enforcement academy, half the day you're at the range, you're shooting, and it's muscle memory. Basically, is that you're building, and you know you're drawing from your holster and you're shooting. You're drawing from your holster and you're shooting. You draw from your holster, and a lot of people think, well, you know, this is monotonous, or I don't want to do it anymore. It gets pretty boring after a while. It's the same thing in martial arts. When you practice martial arts, it's repeating a movement, repeating a movement, repeating a movement. And it's until the point you get to a point where you're doing it naturally. And, you know, when I was first going through training, in the marshal service, they would tell me, okay, you know, this is why we're doing this. It's your training. It's your training. It's your training. You need to train. And then actually when I did time and special operations, in any kind of special operations group, we would go through a building 10, 15, 20 times, no matter how many times. And then we would evaluate who made a mistake, who did this, who did that, who went the wrong way. And it gets to the point where we would just do it it was just a reaction. And I never thought about it. You know, I thought, you know, oh my God, a whole day of training again. And one day, we decided to go through scenarios. We had these role players and we had these little guns with paint balls. And we had this one scenario, and we were supposed to be in a judge's office, and I'm supposed to be protecting the judge. And I was sitting there, and supposedly a crazy guy was supposed to come in. They had a role player. This was a whole role playing type thing, but they would put us through situations. And this crazy guy comes in and starts yelling at the judge and everything else. And I start getting in between them and telling them, you know, this is all acting. And the next thing you know, this guy pulls out a gun. And I'm not kidding you. I reacted. I literally jumped behind the desk, threw the judge down, or the role player down. Poor guy. I think I kind of hurt. He hit his head. But I drew my pistol and shot twice without even thinking. I didn't even, and my pistol. And after the fact, of course, we come back and we stop the scenario, right? Because that was the end of the thing. And the guy shot at me, didn't hit me, didn't hit the judge. And we went and looked at the guy, because we would wear these protective vests because it hurts when you get hit by one of those things. I had 2 perfect shots in the chest without even thinking. I was literally turning around going, tung, 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 tung. And my rounds landed exactly. I had 2 rounds in the chest and 1 straight in the head. Well, and he had a face mask on. And I was just like, wow, that is amazing, because I never even thought, I did it without even thinking. And those are the things, like you said, building these habits, building these lists. And even when you talk about building your list, Mikkel, I mean, I know you like to go through those lists, but the habit of actually making that list, adding to that list, subtracting from that list, that is what it's still a habit, regardless. And then following the list is a habit. So the more you do these things, and like I said, when it comes to security, we do things just automatically. My wife has a federal law enforcement background also. So both of us are on the same page 99.9% of the time. And it's always, did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see him? Did you see her? Did you, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that car. So when we travel, it's between the both of us that, and when I say, I don't feel good about that car that's right next to us, she might look and say, well, I didn't notice it. I didn't feel bad, but you know what? We're going to go with your gut feeling. Let's stop at the gas station, or, let's take off. So it's not just about just myself. When you're with your family, if somebody like your wife notices something, I don't feel good about that. If you go into a restaurant, I don't feel good about this place. You know what? We're not going in the restaurant. And don't think, oh, because I'm the one that thinks about security all the time, that your wife my wife might be right, or your kid might be right. Believe it or not, kids are very perceptive. Kids are very, very, very perceptive, probably more perceptive than adults. And I've known cases where kids have said, Mommy, Daddy, that man over there doesn't look cool. And sure enough, something happens. And so, listen to your family, listen to your gut. Everybody has a perception. And as long as you build these habits of listening to your family, listening to your little one, even your little ones, because a lot of times with the little ones, daddy, 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 mommy, 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 and you kind of get kind of frustrated. Maybe one of the times that she's saying daddy, 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 that guy over there's got a gun and I just noticed it and nobody else has, that's when you need to be aware and not be with, quit bothering me, stop it, because, you're getting on my nerves. And those are the things that you really need to do. And I know it takes a conscientious effort. But once you do it, there's a saying that I think if you repeat something so many times, I don't even remember how many times, it becomes a habit. I think it's like 30 times. And it's the same thing with martial arts. I practiced jujitsu for close to 7 or 8 years. I can't do it anymore, but that's the same thing. It was the same movements over and over and over. But then you start to read the other person. You already start to say, when the other person moves in a certain way, it's like, I got this move. And then the next thing you know, you're throwing them over and you've got the person submitted and you didn't even think about what you did. And even afterwards, you evaluate it with the other individual. And that's when you build those habits. It's repetition.
Well, when you were saying that, I also thought of the famous Bruce Lee quote, which is like, I don't fear the man who has done 10,000 kicks. I fear the man who has done one kick 10,000 times. And it's practicing the same type of thing over and over again. And I did martial arts for 11 years. I was on Team Canada. I competed internationally when I was young in these types of things. So that's always a quote that I always keep in my mind. And another thing that made me think is when you were talking about practicing scenarios. So I was a national lifeguard in Canada, and I did my master scuba diver's license. And I remember I was living in the Canadian high Arctic. This was maybe 15 years ago or something like that. And I had all of this training. We had practiced 1,000 times all these different types of drills if there was an emergency. And I remember the one time someone said, this guy, he's collapsed. And I was the furthest person away. I mean, I was 5 times farther away than anybody else, but somehow I was the first person to reach him. And I had to give him chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth breathing. and someone called the ambulance, and paramedics came, but obviously it's not instant. I mean, it takes them 15, 20 minutes to get there. And if you've ever done CPR in your life, I can tell you it is extraordinarily tiring. I was almost going to collapse. And unfortunately, this story doesn't have a happy ending. He didn't make it. However, I did cry a lot afterwards. I was very upset, just to be honest. I was very upset. But at the same time, I was very glad that I had done all of that training, because if I had not, I think that the feeling would have been that if I had been more prepared, I would have been able to save him. But I actually knew afterwards that I was extremely prepared, because I take a lot of these things very, very serious. And I had practiced it thousands of times, that I did everything I could. And because I did everything I could forgive myself that I wasn't able to save him. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's a real life thing that happened to me on practicing a situation and actually going through something that was very, very stressful in an emergency situation.
No, and if you probably you probably didn't realize it at the time, but everything you did was automatic. When you got there, you were like, okay, let's do this, do that, do the chest compressions and everything else. Everything came to you probably very automatic. Why? Because you probably trained and trained and trained and trained. So that's, and we're talking about professional scenarios. I'm talking about training in an environment for law enforcement. You were talking about training in an environment for lifeguards. But training doesn't necessarily mean you have to go through an academy or go through a school. Training is training yourself to do certain things, training yourself to have certain habits. If you want to be successful, you need to have those habits regardless. We talk about going after bad guys. I did it for a living for 30 years, really bad guys, through investigations. At the very beginning, through fugitive operations. And those fugitive operations were a lot more dangerous because you didn't have a lot of the control. You were knocking on someone's door looking for somebody. And, it was something that we had to, before we would go up to the door, what are we looking at? Who do we have? We would make plans. And, some of those times plans went south. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that they didn't. And luckily we were prepared, and our team was prepared, and we did everything. And even though the things went south, we were able to handle the situation. And
well, I know that you have certain security clearance and things that you're not able to describe, but I would love to hear one or two quick stories. I mean, we probably only have about 5 minutes left in the conversation today, but one or two quick stories of real life things that you had to deal with in your work when you were in some of these countries in Latin America.
Well, as far as, I never really had to deal with a lot in Latin America. Now, I didn't do a lot of work. Most of my work in Latin America was diplomatic work, to be honest with you, because I was meeting with basically for example, Mexico. We met a lot with the head of SAT, which is the head of the revenue collection, which would be the equivalent. They run the customs service, also the directors of immigration. Now, what I can tell you is that I've had some experiences with, in the sense that things were not so secure. Because I was going down to Mexico at a time when the drug war was really, really, really serious. And in Mexico City, we literally would only go from the embassy in armored vehicles all the way to our meetings. And in Brazil, I had a little bit more of a, I've never, to be honest with you, one thing that as far as Latin America, I've never had an issue. Now, Brazil, I lived there actually, and then we would go to different places and we would go out and we would do things. But like I said, I would always take those precautions. I can tell you a lot of things that happened to other people, not necessarily me. And I gave that example of the FBI agent that didn't follow our advice. And I was, like I said, I even went to Bogota a lot, and we hung out in Bogota. It was post Escobar, so it wasn't as bad as it was back then. Before that, prior to that, but I never really had a lot of issues. I was always surrounded, and also not only that, but I was surrounded by a whole group of police officers or police. I mean, whether they be federal, whoever we were working with. I mean, I would literally go out with police. So I even had we had one time we went to a place, and one of the things in Sao Paulo that's very common is to say, "Hey, do you want a bottle?" Yeah, give me a bottle, but they don't tell you how much it is. And then at the end of the night, they come to you with a bill for $6,000 and say, either you pay up or you know what, you go to the back room. And I don't think these guys realized that we were all cops. And these other people were actually federal cops from Brazil. And they did that to us. And needless to say, the minute they tried to say the bill's $6,000, the federal police pulled out all of their badges and says, you know what, we'll close this place down in 2 seconds. And okay, not a problem. And the bill came out to like $50 or $100 like it was supposed to come out to. But I mean, I didn't have any close calls. I didn't do any undercover work in South America, or we normally, when we did operations with the police there, the local police, they usually provided all of the facilities, the undercovers, we were there more as observers whenever we were doing an operation with them. But it was pretty interesting to see how other police departments operate, or other federal agencies operate in the different countries. And I also did a project right before I left. We created a task force in the Middle East in Jordan. That was very interesting to see. And a lot of that stuff is actually above my clearance level now, because I don't have one. But, it was very interesting. It was very interesting to see the other side in those countries, because I got to talk to the police. I got to talk to law enforcement. I got to talk to them how things really work down there, not what the news was portraying.
Sure.
I think that's where, and those are a lot of the stories I can't tell. A lot of times, especially here in Mexico, they always say, one of the things with security is, oh, well, there's no American, this happens to Mexicans. And, because it always comes out in the news that these Mexicans got robbed or whatever it might be, kidnapped. It doesn't happen to Americans. I'm like, little do you know, it happens to more than you think. It's just that the governments don't talk about it, and the news doesn't make the front page of the news. So, I couldn't tell you of any. I have some more stories of when I was more domestic than I was when I was overseas.
Well, there's something to be said for that anyways, because I think that, people kind of assume that you come down to Latin America and this is where all the danger is, but there's lots of danger back home that people have to be careful of. One quick story from my side. In 2003, 2004, I spent 2 months in Colombia, and I was in Bogota, as you were talking about before, and I was staying in La Candelaria, in a really beautiful part of the town, historic and just gorgeous. And there was a big center square about 2 or 3 blocks away from where I was staying. And I was woken up in the middle of the night, not middle of the night, but late night, by a very big boom. And it turned out the next day it was a car bombing, and they were attacking a political person. And I have never seen more police in my entire life, like riot gear police out for days, if not weeks afterwards, hundreds of them everywhere, that you couldn't even cross the center square there. And it happened like 2 to 3 blocks away from where I was sleeping. And that was absolutely mental. And one other time there was a bombing was when I was in Morocco in 2000, but I was at the next town over. So there was one that happened, and it was like maybe an hour or 2 hour drive, but they had targeted a tourist hotel, and it made the news everywhere and made international news. And I had my grandparents and my father and everybody wondering about me, because I was 2 months in Morocco in 2000, 2001, something like that. So things have happened around me, but have not like directly impacted me. I don't know, a certain amount of luck, a certain amount of things that we have been talking about today. But things happen back home as well. So it's not just overseas.
No, and I can tell you a funny story that happened to me in Mexico City. The first time I went to Mexico City, I went by myself. I was supposed to go with another person that had been to Mexico City, and I actually had never been to Mexico City. Believe it or not, all the times I've been to Mexico, this was the first time, and I was going to meet with the head of the head of SAT, which was a customs and revenue collection, and it just so happens it was the day I decided to travel was when they were celebrating the Virgin Mary, the Guadalupe.
Mm-hmm.
And here in Mexico, they love fireworks. And these fireworks aren't just normal fireworks. They're very loud fireworks. And we're in the airport. We get off. I had a driver that met me there from the embassy. We're walking through the parking lot, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. And I hit the ground, literally hit the ground. And the driver's looking at me like, and I'm with all my stuff and everything, I hit the ground. And I'm like, the driver's looking at me like I'm crazy. And he's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I'm like, "What was that? What was that?" And he says, "Oh, you just happen to have come on the celebration of the Virgin Mary. Those were fireworks."
Fuegos artificiales.
And I was just like, I was very embarrassed, needless to say. But, and he says, "As a matter of fact, there's going to be a couple of processions, and it's going to take us a couple of hours to get to the hotel because we're going to be stuck in traffic." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And, but that is something that actually happened. It's a true story that happened to me.
Sure.
But luckily it wasn't a bombing, and luckily it wasn't any kind of gunfire. But
well, when we moved to Panama, the first week, I want to say, in the middle of the night, we'd hear a big boom. And my wife was like, "Oh my God, it's gunshots. It's gunshots." I'm like, "No, it's a car backfiring." She's like, "What's that?" I'm like, in the UAE, they're all brand new Lexuses and everything. So you don't get that in the Middle East. We spent a quarter of our lives living over there. But yeah, here in Panama, crappy gasoline in an old vehicle, car backfires. It's pretty loud, very loud. And it's just a one-off. And she thought that it was gunfire in our neighborhood. I had to gently explain to her that we were okay.
No, and things do happen. And luckily I haven't had any instances. Now we haven't, after I retired, we have had instances where, like I said, we've had to take off and run away, or somebody's following us, or we just like I said, someone literally opened up the door on a van and said, and I had my back to the van. I was walking back towards the gas, and my wife is just like coming, and then because she saw it, and they were like, hey, you, and heaven knows who you was, but I ran into the bus station. Literally, well, I didn't run, but I walked very quickly into the bus station, and they kept going, of course. And so we've had some little calls like that, close calls like that. But I've been very lucky and fortunate, and I probably 99% of my close calls have been working when I was in the United States. And, many, I could go on for hours with stories. But
no, I think this is a perfect place to wrap it up. Ernie, thank you so much. I really enjoy our conversations. I really enjoy getting your insights and all of your experience and telling us about your life. So thank you very much for joining us back on the show. If people want to check out the YouTube channel, if they want to find out more about your work, where can we send them?
I have my YouTube channel called Retired Life in Mexico, No Bull. And basically, if you go into YouTube and you just put Retired Life in Mexico, No Bull, it'll come up. It come up in the search. And on Facebook, I also have a Facebook group of over, I think it's going on 9,000 people now. It's called Retired Life in Mexico, No Bull. Those are the two main avenues of communication that I use, or social media that I use. And I do a variety of videos, everything from like what we talk about today, security, to cost of living, to different issues that you might run into when moving to Mexico.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ernie, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.